Are you struggling with panic attacks or agoraphobia or OCD or health anxiety or generalized anxiety disorder or other problems like that? Well, this week on a really no frills version of the Anxious Truth podcast, an anxiety specialist, a therapist, that would be me, is going to answer a bunch of questions about those very problems. So let's get to that right now. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Anxious Truth podcast. This is episode 328. It is an odd episode because we are doing an episode in a week where we normally wouldn't, but for a variety of reasons, I wanted to do a little fill-in episode. And today we're going to do a Q&A, good old fashioned listener Q&A about anxiety and anxiety disorders. I'm Drew Linsalata. I am a therapist practicing in the area of anxiety and anxiety disorders in the state of New York. I'm also the creator and host of the Anxious Truth podcast. I'm a 3-time author on the topic of anxiety and anxiety disorders, psychoeducator, social media dude, guy with microphones and clearly cameras. And yeah, I'm here to answer a bunch of questions that my Instagram audience sent over in the last couple of days. We're going to do a quick Q&A episode of the Anxious Truth. If you're new to the Anxious Truth, welcome. I hope you find what you hear or see here today useful in some way. Of course, if you're a returning viewer on YouTube or a returning listener, welcome back. I hope you are able to find something in this episode that's useful to you. Before we get into that, just a quick reminder, head on over to my website at theanxioustruth.com. There are way more resources there. All the previous podcast episodes and videos, my social media posts, some very low cost workshops, the books that I've written, a link over to Disordered, which is another free podcast that I do with my buddy Josh Fletcher that comes out on Fridays. That's at disordered.fm. Go to my website at theanxioustruth.com if you like what you hear today on this episode, and avail yourself of all those other resources. There's just a ton of goodies over there. So take advantage of all of this stuff, especially the free stuff. And most of it is in fact free. So this week I want to do a good old fashioned listener viewer Q&A. I asked my Instagram audience yesterday morning to ask me questions, which I will do every once in a while. I haven't done a Q&A episode in probably 6 or 8 months now. So I figured as a little fill-in episode here in the middle of October of 2025, it was a good time to do that. So I'm just going to kind of look at some of the questions. If you're watching on YouTube, you will see me like looking over at my other screen here because I have a bunch of the questions in front of me, and I'm going to try to answer as many as I can. I can't answer each individual question, and it's important for me to say to you guys that there are certain questions that an online helper just will never be able to answer for you because we don't know you. I talk about this quite often. You don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that the guy that you see on YouTube or Instagram with the big microphone and the deep voice somehow is going to be able to tell you exactly what to do and exactly how to respond and exactly how to handle your thoughts and emotions. We can't. I don't know you. So I can't answer everybody's individual questions. Be careful about that. There is a limitation to the amount of educating or helping that can be done in this kind of environment. So just keep that in mind, because I don't want you to fall into the trap of thinking that, you know, I will follow specific directions from a guy on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram or on a podcast. That's not really right. It doesn't work that way. There are times when there is just no substitute for qualified in-person or one-to-one help, right? So keep that in mind. I'll also, in certain instances, group some of these questions together, because while they were different questions from a lot of different people, they often fall into general categories. So if I can't answer every single question in that category, I'll try to give you a general answer in a given category. So the first category that I want to talk about is anxiety symptoms. Like every time I do a Q&A, I get asked a ton of questions about anxiety symptoms. But what about when your heart is palpitating? But what about when you're scared of your breath? But what about dizziness? But what about nausea? But what about when your legs are shaking? But what when it feels like you're off balance? So a bunch of the questions are always about that. And here's the blanket answer in that category. There is a reason why, if you follow along with me on the social media platforms, or you listen to the podcast, or you read my books, or you listen to Disordered, there's a reason why you don't hear us talk about specific symptoms. I never give tips on how to deal with specific symptoms. Probably as close as I ever come to that is talking about not hyperventilating, because that's silly. There's really no reason to like hyperventilate. You can in fact work with that, but that's the only time I even come close to that. There's a reason why I don't talk about specific anxiety symptoms, and that's because they're all the same. The toughest anxiety symptom to deal with is the one that scares you the most now. And anybody who's been struggling with these kind of problems for a long enough period of time, which I hate, but if you have been struggling for a long enough period of time, you probably recognize that the symptom that scares you today is not the same physical symptom or sensation that scared you 6 months ago or 3 months ago. They tend to morph. They tend to change over time. They are all the same. know this: when you are scared, when you are upset, when you feel vulnerable, when you feel like you are, subject to some perceived threat or doom or danger, your body is designed to respond to that appropriately. So anxiety symptoms are just scared bodies doing scared body things. That is your body operating the way it is designed. It is responding to what your brain thinks you need in that moment. The issue here is that your brain is actually wrong. It's predicting something that is not correct and mobilizing resources that don't need to be mobilized in that moment. So while those are very uncomfortable sensations, of course, very scary sensations, we don't treat them as problems. Like, they are uncomfortable, they are disruptive, they are scary, they are difficult to deal with, but we don't try to control them. And we have no special tips for how to feel less off balance or how to slow your heartbeat down or anything like that. And there's also a general, in some of the questions, like there was a person who sent in a question about heart palpitations, which could be a wide variety of things. For some reason, some people will use the word palpitations just to describe that situation where you can feel your heart beating very rapidly or feel it pounding. Sometimes people will use that to describe things like that fluttery skipped heartbeat, which is usually PVCs, which again, make sure that your cardiologist or your medical team has checked that out. But assuming you have been checked out, like, the word palpitations is a kind of a catch-all for scary sensations centered around your heart. This person wanted to know how to deal with palpitations, because the assertion from that person is that, no, when there are heart palpitations, all bets are off. There has to be some sort of special thing, because there's no way that I can allow that. There's no way I can learn to accept that and work through that. And other people will say the same thing about nausea or tummy sensations that come along with being anxious or scared, or shaking or sweating, or whatever it happens to be, like scared bodies doing scared body things. If you're starting from the assertion that, like, no, I can't do anything else unless you tell me how to deal with that particular sensation, because it's the one that is really scary to me right now, you'll get really frustrated. And when people do try to control or mediate or modulate specific symptoms, and they find techniques that might work for them, then what winds up happening is they'll often find that another symptom comes raging in the back door. So I used to be really afraid of my heart, and I figured out how to slow my heartbeat down with special breathing or whatever it is I do. Or I sit down right away, I meditate, I bring my heart rate down, but then dizziness kicks in, or nausea kicks in, or whatever else kicks in. So we don't really try to operate specifically in anxiety symptoms. The principle we're relying on here is that the state that you fear so much is certainly uncomfortable, often unexplainable, not desired, not needed in that moment, but not an emergency. So we don't want to treat anxiety symptoms like emergencies, even though they scare you. All right. So those of you who ask questions about specific physical sensations of anxiety, know that they're normal, they're expected. I think I did an episode on anxiety sensations, I don't know, in the last year or so. If you go through the YouTube channel, the podcast episodes, you'll see that. And I talked about how common the experiences are, how many people have these same sensations that come up over and over and over again. So if you want to check that out, that's fine. I did that episode just to kind of normalize the experience of your body doing things when anxious, right? Another common category of questions that I really want to talk about today is the same as the symptoms, except they're thought-based. So other people will say, yeah, but I'm having thoughts about insanity. I'm afraid that I'm going to lose it. I'm going to snap. I'm going to have a psychotic break. That's important to tell me how to deal with that thought. Other people will say, I'm really stuck on thoughts about death and existence. Other people will say that they're stuck on thoughts about their relationships or their kids, or whether they're being a good parent, or whether they're ever going to succeed. People will say, I get stuck on thoughts that I'm never going to get better, and I'm just going to be anxious for the rest of my life. So thoughts, we treat the same way as we do anxiety symptoms. You can't choose to not have a thought. So everybody wants to ask, how do I stop myself from thinking this? Or how do I stop myself from feeling this? We can't. The principle we're always relying on here in this podcast and in the books that I write and all the content I create and in my therapy practice is that we do not try to control these experiences, because that never really works. And when it doesn't work, we get even more frantic, and we feel like it's more urgent because we feel like nothing works and it's really out of control, and oh my God, what's going to happen next? And you confirm to your brain that it needs to keep predicting a nightmare whenever it encounters that anxious state inside of you. So thoughts are really not any different than physical sensations. So One of the things I always like to talk about is if we put 1,000 anxious people in a room and said, which one is worse, physical sensations or thoughts, it would be split about 50-50. Like, no, people who are afraid of their thoughts, somebody who's fixated on the idea of death or maybe the idea of insanity will say, I would pay to have palpitations. That doesn't scare me at all. I'm not worried about that. But the thought, oh, that's the worst. Or people will say, no, I don't really care about the thoughts, but this feeling of depersonalization just scares me so much. I need special instructions on that. But thoughts are kind of the same, right? So we have two categories of questions that always come up when I do a Q&A. One is about how to deal with specific symptoms, and there's nothing specific about your symptom that requires specific instructions. We don't treat them like they're emergencies or problems to solve, just experiences to have. And the same thing holds true with thoughts. We do not have special rules for each specific scary thought that you have. And this is going to sound kind of crazy to a lot of people, especially if you're new to this, but I promise this is a principle we rely on, and it is valid. There is no special thought. People will say, yeah, but what about thoughts that I don't really love my kids? Or what about thoughts? What if I'm having the thought that I'm going to forget my kids' names and their birthdays? Like, clearly that I can't just allow that, right? Yeah, you can. There are no thoughts that fall outside of that. None. Thoughts are thoughts, right? And people will often say, and I will explain this, self-harm thoughts. There's a common OCD theme that revolves around harm or self-harm, but many people with different forms of anxiety disorders will be dogged with the idea that they may accidentally hurt themselves. If you're dealing with that and you're listening to this today or watching this video, know that that's an incredibly common thing too. Even those thoughts we do not treat specially, because if you are terrified of that thought because you have no desire whatsoever to hurt yourself or somebody else, but you're terrified because you're having a thought about it and you think that that might overpower you and you'd actually do it, it's okay. It's just a thought. We do not respond to that like it's an emergency. So it's a hard sell. And if you're freaked out by your thoughts right now and you like, it can't possibly be, this thought seems so important because it threatens my identity or my well-being or my relationships or my family or who I think I really am, I promise it's okay. Like, that freaked out feeling doesn't indicate that the thought really is special or needs any kind of special instructions. This is where we hit the limit of what an online helper can do, because you're going to want to ask me more questions, either about your specific thought or fear, or about the specific symptom that you're struggling with, or the specific trigger or context, and it begins to fall down. So this is where in my therapy practice, people sit with me every week and we get to talk about things in great detail and I get to know them and we get to work through it that way. But I can give you general principles today, right? If it helps. Third category that I'm going to go into before I try to answer some specific questions, as many as I can in a shorter episode, is about the difference between acceptance and control strategies. So many of the questions that I get when I ask for questions and I do a Q&A episode are based on the idea that there still must be some way to control this experience. Often people who are following along for a long enough time, well, you know what, let me break this down. If you're new, like if this is the first time you've stumbled upon this podcast or my YouTube channel or whatever, and you've never heard of this type of approach to chronic and disordered anxiety, which is an acceptance and mindfulness-based approach, it would be natural for you to think, oh, cool, an anxiety therapist, he's going to teach me how to regulate my nervous system, how to calm down. He's going to teach me how to like stop this symptom from happening. He's going to teach me how to quiet my mind, but he's not. This anxiety therapist is not going to teach you that. And most anxiety specialists are not going to teach you that, because we are acceptance-based, not control-based. If we start, I didn't think it was going to pop up, but trying desperately to control thoughts, control emotions, control bodily sensations, control neurochemistry, control hormones, control digestion, the frantic attempt to control how your body and mind works is part of what creates the disordered and chronic state to begin with. So a lot of the questions I get tend to be about, how do I insert regulation strategy here? How do I quiet my mind? How do I stop being afraid of? How do I not fear? How do I not think about? How do I not feel? How do I stop my body from, if you are if you're new, I understand why you want control strategies, but if you've been looking for more podcasts or videos or social media content about anxiety, I'm guessing it's because you've seen all the control strategies and you haven't found anything that works. So you're looking for more. Understood. but I'm not going down that road here. Generally speaking, hang around, check out all the other content and stuff that I said, like start at my website, go to all the resources. You'll see what principles we're relying on here. These are the most empirically validated principles we have in mental health today and for the last number of decades. But if you have been following along for a while and you have heard all of this stuff before, tolerate, accept, float, maybe you come out of the Eau Claire Week School or whatever, that's fine. And you get it. This is an acceptance-based approach. I have to accept my anxiety, learn to move through it instead of away from it or controlling it. But you're still trying to also use control techniques alongside that. That is also a lot of the questions that I get when I ask my audience to ask me questions. It's people who hear about acceptance and tolerance and mindfulness and floating and all of those things and not fighting and doing less about anxiety, but are still also trying to do that while they try to control the experience in the form of, how do I turn off this thought? How do I make my brain quiet down? How do I stop my body from doing this thing that I hate? How do I stop thinking about? And that's super frustrating. So there are no control strategies here. In fact, what we're trying to do generally when I work with my therapy clients is we're trying to become more aware of that reflexive automatic resistance in the form of trying to escape or control those negative internal experiences or difficult experiences. And then we learn to stop doing that. So we allow the experience to come and peak and play itself out, and we learn from that. So that's kind of the other category that I wanted to talk about in terms of questions. Those categories that I just gave you, the broad categories in the Q&A, tend to, cover most of the questions that I get when I do a Q&A episode or I ask people to ask me questions. Most of them fall into those broad categories. So if you ask a question or you have a question about anxiety, keep those sort of broad answers in mind, because there's a good chance that what I said in the last, 15 minutes will apply to the question that you have if you look at the broad brush view. So I will take maybe 10 minutes or so and try to answer some specific questions. I did answer some of the questions on my Instagram. So if you're not following me on Instagram, you can do that. I'm just the.anxious.truth. Follow me over there if you want. Also, I would say if you like to read, and I highly suggest you do more than just scroll with your thumb all day long to learn these things, like watching a video here on YouTube or listening to this podcast episode that goes on for 20 or 30 minutes is a good idea. But I'm also pretty active I have a Substack where I write there about these things. I publish little mini articles almost every day. There's usually one big one on Wednesdays. Things get more in depth. It's way easier to learn in longer form content. And I think I teach best when I write. So the books and that sort of stuff, like really, you got to kind of dig in a little more to that stuff. Asking questions in the scroll and hoping to get meaningful, actionable answers in an endless scroll environment is really difficult. We do our best, people like me, to try to help, but those environments are really difficult. It's hard for us to help in that environment. So let's talk about a couple of very specific things. Here's one. You know what? This is a little bit of a category. A couple of people asked about the idea of, I like to call them like the meta emotions. So if you're listening to this podcast or watching this video on YouTube, there's a really good chance you're dealing with anxiety, which looks like things like uncertainty or feelings of doom or vulnerability or fear, just flat out fear. And people will often want to know, like, how do I start to trust myself again? I've lost the ability to trust my mind. I've lost the ability to trust my body. Like, I feel like my mind and my body are betraying me. And then they start to there's emotions that come along with that. So the emotion itself is fear or vulnerability or feelings of doom. But then there's the meta emotion, which is I'm now upset because I keep being afraid. And I feel like my mind is out of control and I feel like my body is out of control. So there's that. And then there's the whole, like, I feel like I've lost my way. I've forgotten who I am, like the struggle every day. How do you deal with the frustration of the struggle? That's important and often overlooked. Where usually in this sort of environment, people are trying to find information, techniques, whatever, hacks and things of that nature, which you're not going to get hacks from me, but they're looking to operate directly on the anxiety itself. But do not forget that being in a chronically anxious state, dealing with an anxiety disorder for any prolonged period of time, is going to create emotions about that. So frustration, sadness, feelings of despair, feelings that you're losing yourself. You've lost your identity. You're not sure who you are anymore. You're not even sure what you're capable anymore. You feel like you can't trust yourself anymore. It might be creating problems in your interpersonal relationships, maybe in your intimate relationships or your friendships or your co-working relationships or your family relationships. Like, those are going to make big emotions, and we have to make room for those as well. I cannot tell you how to not feel those emotions. I'm here to tell you that you have to recognize that it's normal to feel discouraged. It's normal to feel angry. It's normal to feel upset. It's normal to be frustrated by this. Like, you got to be able to express those things because you're a human being and you're entitled to those emotions. And I think that's an often overlooked subject here when we talk about chronic and disordered anxiety. The emotions that the struggle itself will create are real. But remember, people who are in an anxious state tend to overvalue their thoughts to begin with. That's part of the problem. I believe every thought my mind makes. And so the emotions like frustration or despair or feeling kind of sad about the situation then get amplified and trick you into thinking, well, I'm sad because I've been struggling for so long. And then I believe that that thought is a predictor of my future. And then I draw a conclusion from it that I'm never going to get better. So just be careful about that. This is nuanced. And again, this is a thing that we'd spend time on, probably a prolonged amount of time if you were a therapy client, and you might do that with your own therapist or counselor, but just try to keep that in mind. Being frustrated because you are struggling with anxiety is really normal. Like, you're entitled to those emotions because you're a human being. You're subject to them just like all of us are. Just be careful about drawing forever conclusions about emotions that you're having right now about your current situation. All right. So I know it feels like sometimes you lost yourself or you don't know how to trust yourself again. The answer to finding yourself and learning to trust yourself again is always found in experiences. So we have to have new experiences that we think we shouldn't have. They're too scary. They're too hard. They're too triggering, which is another thing. A broad brush answer to questions is, well, how am I supposed to get better when this triggers me? Well, you notice we don't talk about triggers a lot either. We use triggers. We want triggers. We need the triggers in this process of improving your wellness, desensitizing, recovering, whatever you want to call it, because we need to learn that being triggered is not something we have to engineer our lives around. It creates a very uncomfortable, very difficult to handle, very scary internal experience. But if we leave that alone, it comes and goes and we can tolerate that. We're trying to learn that, right? So we have to have those learning experiences that we are scared to have. And those we feed information back into our brains, our minds, those decision-making and prediction algorithms that then to begin to suggest that, like, oh, maybe I can actually handle this. Maybe this isn't the disaster I've been insisting that it is. This is not to say that it's not uncomfortable. You are genuinely scared in those moments, genuinely uncomfortable, generally frightened. Like, that's not just in your head, but we have to learn that we can handle that, right? So how do you learn to deal with those meta emotions or feeling like you've lost the ability to trust yourself and know yourself? We have to have these experiences. So not only do we get the benefit of learning the lessons that apply in the anxious moments, which ultimately lead to that, we'll say, recovered state or desensitized state, and then does lower your overall anxiety level as a happy secondary impact. We're never trying to operate directly on that. As a tertiary happy impact on that is that those meta emotions of frustration and despair tend to be addressed as well. So we got to have experiences. We got to do the hard things, the scary things, and we learn from those. And we also get to address those other meta concerns, right, that come up. So that was a lot of words to answer that sort of other category of questions. There are people who are asking about, this one is a good one too. Like, this is along the lines of the control strategy. So one person said, do lifestyle changes make a difference in OCD/anxiety recovery? It's a really good question. This speaks to the control thing. Now, in terms of lifestyle changes, which I'm going to interpret in this context as dietary or exercise, or, you know, what things you're putting in your body, self-care, sleep, rest, that sort of stuff. You know, I stopped eating dairy, whatever it is you think is right for you. There's nothing wrong with those things. I urge everybody to try to live as healthy a lifestyle as you want to. Like, I would urge everybody to take care of their bodies and minds. We only get one body, right? Take good care of it while you got it. So I'm a fan of healthy lifestyle, 100%. I just don't give that a huge amount of weight in the recovery or desensitization or improvement process, because that's an attempt at control. So what tends to happen in a population of anxious people who are dealing with chronic and disordered states of anxiety is that they get fixated on healthy lifestyle, holistic, natural, healthy lifestyle. Food is medicine. Exercise fixes everything. Like, sitting in the sun does everything. Like, yeah, do all those things, exercise, eat healthy, do all those things, do all the things. I want you to do all the things. But we have to be really careful about saying, oh, if I start to change my diet and improve my gut health, then I'll stop having repetitive thoughts about stabbing my dog. No, that just simply does not play out in the real world. As much as the wellness influencer and holistic health and like lifestyle industry and subgenre wants that to be true, we have no evidence at all that that's true. In fact, in this particular niche, we find that it can be counterproductive. So lifestyle changes, I'm all for it. Like, stress management is a thing. It's hard to deal with an anxiety disorder if you're living in a hugely stressful environment all the time that anybody would consider stressful. So yeah, stress management, self-care, healthy lifestyle, do all the things. Just don't expect that to somehow change the way you relate to your own body and mind, because this is really a problem of how you relate to your own thoughts and your own body. Right. So that's important. That's a question I wanted to answer. There were some questions about, family dynamics, whether it's the family is not very accepting of your anxiety struggles, or they're pushing you too hard, or they're berating you for that. That's a tough situation. It's always what we really want in our closest sort of support system, friends and family, is cheerleading. The best thing you can ask for, in my opinion, if you're asking me and you all asked me, and if you're watching this video or listening to the podcast, I guess you want to hear my answers to this. What you want to ask for from your support system, your friends, your family, your closest people, is an acknowledgement that you truly are afraid in those moments. You truly are unsure. You truly feel incapable, but a reminder that that's not correct. So the best thing a support person can do for you when you've been triggered into that like really difficult state is to say, listen, I know you're really terrified right now. I can see it. This is not just in your head, but I also know you can handle this feeling. You don't need me to save you. You don't need me to take you home. You don't need to be excused from life because you're feeling this way. I know you want to just go and retreat and be protected, and you have a right to feel safe. But the best way to learn to be safe is I will sit with you while you navigate through this feeling. You don't need me to save you. That's paraphrased. It's oversimplified, but that's what you're looking for from your family and your friends. And when I work with therapy clients and we involve their support people, that's what we teach them. And it makes a big difference. If you are in abusive, always stressful, always pressing on you family situations or friendships and that sort of relationships, that does matter. Like, remember, in this thing that we call recovery or whatever you want to call it, we are always relying on the idea that every internal experience is transient, right? It starts, it peaks, it fades. Every experience we have is like that. So we need to see that when I'm really anxious or afraid or upset or feeling really vulnerable or like threatened, if I do nothing with that, because there really is no actual threat, it just feels like it on the inside. That's the difference between disordered anxiety and other anxiety. There's no actual threat. If I just leave that alone and don't try to fix it or control it or get away from it or save myself or be saved, that experience peaks and peters out and it gets replaced by a different experience, because that's just the way human life works. Well, if that experience gets replaced by an abusive household or an abusive or damaging or really stressful, like domestic or home environment or work environment, then you feel like you never feel to come down. So we do care about that. If you are in a very stressful or abusive or threatening environment all the time, it kind of matters. I don't have any good advice for you there because that's a much bigger question. But the only thing I could tell you is recognize that if you are in a situation where the environment that you are in has you agitated at level 7 the minute you open your eyes in the morning, you have nowhere to go with that. It becomes very hard to learn how to accept and navigate through anxious moments when the anxious moments seemingly never go away because the environment that you're in, understandably and predictably, keep causing you to be anxious and agitated. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't mean you can never get better. It just means that your baseline might be artificially high because of the environment that you're in. Another question about friends and family and support systems were people who are trying to support anxious people. What I said before counts. Like if you're trying, if your loved one, your friend, your partner, whatever has OCD or an anxiety disorder, they keep coming to you to be saved and to be reassured. Do I look okay? Am I going to be okay? Am I safe? What does it mean when your arm hurts? You have to learn to not answer that question. The way you'd want to respond to that would be, I know it feels like you need that answer because you're afraid right now, but how about we experiment together with not getting that answer and watching what happens to that internal experience that you're having? So you want to be a cheerleader. Like I said, there are instances when the family and friends thinks you're not getting better fast enough. You're going to have to ask for a little more patience. Again, very individual. I cannot give you steps on how to deal with your family and friends because they don't know you or your family or friends. And there were also instances where, for whatever reason, and because of the dynamics that you're in, whether it's in a one-to-one relationship or a family relationship or a friends group, getting better is not good. Like, people get a little bit wiggly on you when you start to like stand on your own again and be less needy. That can happen too. I hate that, but it is true. So some people asked about that. All I can do is validate that. For some people, they discover that, ooh, the people I thought would be super happy that I'm getting better, not so happy. Suddenly they're seeing it as a threat, or they don't like that I don't need them as much anymore. That can happen, right? Do you fear panic attacks less by exposing yourself to situations that bring on panic? And the answer to that is yes. It's not the situation. Remember that when we are doing exposure, it has nothing to do with the place that you go or the thing that you do or the show that you watch or the story that you read. It has to do with the sense that the experience inside you that gets triggered when you do those things. So yeah, the way we learn that we do not have to fear panic attacks, we hate them. We don't want them. Totally fine. You can hate them for the rest of your life. I hate them. I might have one today. Don't know. Haven't had a panic attack quite a long time. Could have one today. Don't care. Rather not, but don't care. How did I get there? By practicing panicking. So yes, you want to go into situations that may trigger panic. People who are dealing with panic disorder and agoraphobia is a natural outgrowth of that, want to get better, but they want to work around that. Like, I want to learn how to not fear this, but I also don't want to actually experience it. That's an incompatible goal. So yes, you have to be, now, do you have to panic to recover from panic disorder? No, but you have to be 100% willing to be. And paradoxically, if you're willing to panic, there's a really good chance you won't panic. So yes, you do. That's the principle of exposure. Again, there was a bunch of questions about like, yeah, but what about when you are watching the kids? What about when you're driving, the kids are in the car and you have this sensation? I get it. It feels like you have to do something about that, but you don't. Gut brain questions are control strategy questions. Can you feel fear without fearing? And I'm going to end in a couple of minutes. I'll do 2 or 3 more. Can you feel fear without fearing? That's an excellent question, because generally speaking, in anxiety disorder, the hallmark of disordered anxiety is anxious about being anxious, afraid to be afraid. I think you have to recognize that when you are triggered, you are in fact really afraid. You are actually afraid. The internal experience that you have of fear, if you listen to last episode with Lisa Feldman Barrett, Dr. Barrett was saying like, no, those are real. That's a real experience inside you. It's a real experience that you call fear. Nobody gets to tell you that you're not really afraid. You really are. But you have to learn how to interact with that in a different way, right? If your house is on fire and you feel fear, well, you interact with that in one way. You run out of the house, you call for help. You do something about that. If you feel afraid because you just feel afraid and there's no actual danger, well, we learn to interact with that in a different thing. So what we learn is that the feeling of fear doesn't always get coupled with danger. I can be afraid right now, and if I can notice I'm just feeling afraid and I hate this, so I'm trying to fix that feeling, I don't have to fix that feeling. What happens to it? Well, it naturally like ebbs and flows organically, and then I learn from that. So can you feel fear without fearing? You can learn to feel fear and recognize that you want to resist it and fight it to get away from it, but then work on not doing that. So good question. Let's do 2 more. How's that? Morning anxiety. People asked about morning anxiety and night anxiety. How do you deal with morning anxiety? How do you deal with night anxiety? Same. The rules are the same. The difference between a panic attack and a nocturnal panic attack is nocturnal panic attacks happen at night. Are they more jarring because you didn't expect it to happen? Sure. But it doesn't make it any different. Like, the same general rules would apply. And the same thing with morning anxiety. I wake up and I'm instantly anxious. I know that's a crappy situation. I don't want anybody to wake up anxious here. Of course, I'd rather you wake up happy and ready for the day. That's not realistic. Right now, you do wake up anxious. There's no special way to treat that. How do you deal with night anxiety, nocturnal panic, or morning anxiety is a control question. How do I stop that from happening? You don't. You learn that when it happens, you do not have to treat it like an emergency. And over time, as it turns out, when you work on that as your primary goal, the happy secondary impact is that you're less anxious in the morning and have less nocturnal panic attacks. So that's really important. Let's see here. I'll end it with this question here. Well, there was two that I wanted to get to. Hang on here. Let me look. There were two. Another self-help author you always recommend. I rarely ever suggest self-help books as we know them, right? So if you have seen Oprah, have somebody on her media empire who wrote a book about anxiety or mental health, odds are you're not going to hear me talk about that. If it's in Reese Witherspoon's book club, if it's in like some big entrepreneurial influencer's mental health list, I'm probably not going to talk about that book because I don't really talk about self-help books. But you cannot go wrong reading any book that was written by Sally Winston and Martin Seif. If you read any of their books, you cannot go wrong. They're not going to look like self-help books. They're going to look a lot like the things you hear on this podcast or in Disordered, the other podcasts I do, or in my own books. But I will always recommend the books that are written by Dr. Sally Winston and Marty Seif. They are legends in this field and they will not steer you wrong, but they're not going to give you all kinds of hacks, and there's no big mic drop moments about your mental health. So keep that in mind. And then the last thing that I really want to talk about is, it's this one. Do you have any tips for taking the lesson on board after an exposure so it's not wasted? Best for last, right? We're 36 minutes into this episode. Wow, 36 minutes, the longest one I've done in a long time. Thanks for hanging in there, by the way, if you made it all the way to the end. This is a great question because we do exposures, like the idea of an acceptance-based approach to an anxiety disorder is I'm not trying to get away from it or fix it or control it or stop it from happening. I'm going to let the experiences come up, even though I hate them and they scare me. I'm going to learn to work through them. Sometimes we use exposure to intentionally trigger that bad experience. We always do it to learn, always. So before you decide to do an exposure, face your fear, go ahead and act and get intentionally triggered, whether it's on purpose and it's sort of an artificial setting that you had to construct with your therapist, or life is just making you do a challenging thing that will trigger you. Always remember what you're trying to do. I am choosing to do this and expecting that I will get triggered. I am not going to go and face my fear and try to not be afraid. I'm not going to go and do a scary thing and try to not panic. I am doing this to accept whatever the experience gives me organically. If I get triggered, if I have a full panic attack, if my OCD flares up, okay, that's what I'm doing this for. And I'm not going to take evasive action. I'm going to notice my urge to take evasive or saving or control-based action. And I'm going to experiment with not doing that. And I'm going to watch what happens to this experience organically. If I just leave it alone, what can I learn from that? The thing that makes it almost impossible to take the lesson from an exposure is incorrect expectations. I see people all the time that they keep saying, I just keep doing the exposures, but I'm not getting better. And what they're doing is they're going out and facing things that are triggering, and they try to control their response, or they try to not be triggered. And then they are, and then they don't understand why this isn't working. So expectations matter. I want you to accept that mission. And especially if you're working with a therapist, like, it's really important to get some guidance there, but accept the actual mission. Don't say like, well, I'll go and do the things and try to control how I feel. And then when I can't, and I'm anxious and I'm panicking, and I'm scared, then I don't want to do it again and nothing is working. Exposure doesn't work. Make sure you know why you're doing the exposure, what the principle is, what you're trying to accomplish, and what you're trying to learn. And the other thing that gets in the way of learning the lesson of the exposure is harsh judgment. Josh and I just recorded episode 130 of Disordered. Go to disordered.fm to find that podcast about Craig the Critic. We talk about Craig the Critic. That's that internal critic that pops up all the time. Do not let that get in the way of the exposure, in the form of, you shouldn't even have to do this to begin with. The fact that you're anxious about going to the supermarket should never happen. You're having these crazy irrational thoughts about hurting your kids. You're supposed to love your kids. You're not supposed to have that thought. Something is wrong with you. Be mindful of the critical voice that will stand in the way of learning the lessons from the experience, right? So that was a long time. I didn't expect to do 40 minutes of this today, to be honest with you. I thought this would be a quick one, but there were a lot of great questions, and I'm happy to talk about it. So I'm sorry if I couldn't answer your specific question. If you asked it on Instagram, I do the best I can. I usually get a ton of these. So hopefully the broad categories helped you, and a couple of the basic ones that I did specifically. Hopefully, again, remember the limitation of these platforms. Keep that in mind all the time so you don't get stuck in a trap. You don't want to wind up in a vulnerable position where an online helper can promise you that they can fix you, or they can give you the trick or the one thing. We can't. So always keep that in mind when you're consuming this kind of content. You don't want to get trapped into that. But yeah, hopefully you found some of this helpful or useful in some way. And I guess that's it. So we'll be back again next week. So this is a rare time where there are 3 episodes of The Anxious Truth in a row. Usually I publish them every other week. Disordered comes out every week, but I'll be back next week. I think I have Joanna Hardis on next week. She's a frequent guest on this podcast. She's awesome. So come back and check that out. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or some platform that lets you rate and review a podcast, maybe leave a 5-star rating if you really like The Anxious Truth, and maybe take a second and write a quick review, telling people why you like podcasts, because it helps more people find it. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, maybe that little notification bell, so you know when I upload new videos, and like the video if you like the video, because then it tells YouTube that you actually want me to do more of this. Otherwise they tend to bury these things, which happens. It's okay. I'll keep making them, but it's nice to let YouTube know that you enjoyed what I made today. So anyway, thanks for hanging out, whether you're watching or listening. I appreciate you. Try and take whatever little lesson you can out of this sort of content, and any little change that you can make to your approach any day counts. It doesn't matter how small that change is. This is a process of gradual change, small changes, little experiments that add up over time. It's natural to be impatient and want to get better instantly, but shoot at the right target, which is I need to learn that I can handle this. I need to build a new relationship with my own body and mind. And then the happy secondary outcome is I'll probably start to feel better over time. So little moves in that direction count. They will add up. I promise you could do it. I think everybody could do it. I hope everybody could do it. Hope I've been helpful in some way. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you next time. We're out.